Welcome to Lived In, the interior design podcast for ordinary people living in ordinary homes. It's season 4, and we're learning how to think differently about our homes. So this week, we're talking about what to do if the old house that you live in is less architectural gem and a bit more architectural salvage. Let's get into it. No small talk this week. I want to just go ahead and get into the main topic of conversation today, which is what to do if the old architecture you live in isn't actually that great. So I think we kind of have to start with a question. And that question is, what do I mean by a crappy old house exactly? And I think there are a few different ways that an old house can be crappy. Let's say there are 4. So the first one is that it could have been designed with very little regard for the setting. So for example, it's at the bottom of a hill and it regularly floods. Or it has been built in such a way that there is little to no natural light, or the ceiling is covered in what many designers call ceiling acne with too many canned lights and not enough task lighting. It could also just be a house that hasn't aged well in terms of modern convenience. It's poorly insulated, for example, or it is built with no closets or pantry, or it has fixtures that don't make sense for a modern family, like a tiny laundry closet or vanities that hit mid-thigh instead of mid-upper body, things like that. The third way I think an old house could be crappy would be if it hasn't been maintained very well. This is fairly common. So it could be something like the floors are sagging or bouncy, or they're moisture damaged. Things have been patched over and over again with no regard for craftsmanship, or worse, everything has received the landlord special and it's all caked and covered in white paint. The glossy kind. The final way I think a house can be, an old house specifically, can be crappy is just if it has crappy architecture or it lacks any kind of architecture at all. The house lacks focal points, good spatial ratios, clear flow, and any sense of good attention to detail. And I think on this aspect, sometimes that's the way it has always been, and other times it's the way other owners have made it. And either way, it's terrible. It sucks. So what if you live in a crappy old house? Where do we begin this crazy journey? The remedy for this is really going to depend on what the ailment, so to speak, if we want to call it those, what the ailment is. And before I even get into that, the first thing that I will say, and we are about 3 minutes in and I'm already coming with you somewhere that is controversial, but the first thing that I will say, and maybe this is even a subject for a different episode, and I will get there eventually. I will finish this sentence, maybe. But the first thing I will say is that maybe the crappy old house just isn't for you. If you have followed along with this podcast for a while, then you know that I'm in real estate and I help people buy and sell houses all the time. And what I have learned in my time as a realtor is that crappy old houses are a lot of work. A developer will tell you that, a builder will tell you that, and people who have renovated them will tell you that, or lived in them will tell you that. They are a lot of work, and that can be remedied with the right financial investment, but you really need to be realistic about the amount of work that needs to be done, and the fact that old houses pretty much always have unforeseen, unwelcome, and very unpleasant surprises. So unless you are a plumber, an electrician, a certified roof repairer, or a contractor, there are always things that you won't be able to fix yourself. And so you need to be able to account for those. There are high ticket things. High ticket things would include foundation issues, whole plumbing replacement, whole electrical system replacement, new ductwork, a new HVAC system, new flooring throughout, new roofing. So you have to be aware. And if you don't have deep pockets and you don't have a lot of available income, buying a house that needs a lot of work is just not a good idea. This isn't even limited to crappy old houses. This is just a house that needs a lot of work. So there's my controversial advice. But what happens if you are already in the crappy old house? What do you do? We'll get to that after this quick break. For the last 4 years, I've been part of the Haystack Realty Group real estate team. And this week, as we talk about crappy old houses, I can safely say that, yes, they can be money pits. But it's also true that there are some truly incredible old houses out there, and I love helping people find them. Just this week, I've seen 3 beautiful old homes hit the market in and around Pitt County. The first is an 1,800 square foot, circa 1904 home with original hardwood floors and stunning fireplaces. The second is a 1910 home in the Greek Revival style with large columns, and it's set over a half-acre lot and features impressive double-height columns. I mean, you think of the grandeur you can think of, that's what this house has. And the final property is very different. It's a craftsman bungalow built in 1920, and it's set over 3 floors. With around 1,800 square feet, the house is flooded with light thanks to all the windows, and it features original beadboard paneling. So if you are looking for an older home with story and character, sign up for my newsletter through the link in the show notes to get notified. All right, back to the episode. So we've established 4 main ways that old houses can be crappy. Let's talk about remedying those things one at a time. The first one was that it was poorly situated. They didn't really consider the landscape. So let's start there. Obviously, you cannot really change the site of your home unless, you guessed it, deep pockets. You could, in theory, raise your home and move it somewhere else. But the reality is that's likely not the option for most of us. And so we have to think about the things that we can change that are within our control and are realistic and affordable for us. So if you're dealing with issues like flooding, look for clever landscaping solutions like French drains or regrading, or building up the site to slope water away. You can also use clever guttering to collect rainwater and position it away from the house. Fairly straightforward fixes if you're hiring somebody else to do them that don't require you touching a bunch of other things. If the issue with your site is that you're not capturing enough light, it's very wooded, you can cut back trees, you can add or expand windows, you can replace solid doors with doors that have glass. That's something I've definitely considered in our home. Or you can open up the walls between rooms so that you can allow existing light to flow through without having to touch the exterior of the home. Now, if the issue is privacy, because of how other buildings or roads are positioned around you, you can leverage hedges and trees or strategic fencing. And fencing potentially could be cheaper, it depends on what you choose. But really tackling those kinds of issues are going to be budget dependent and dependent on what kind of rules there are where you live. Obviously, the massive caveat for the entire episode here is that if your home is on the historic register, there are going to be very specific rules for you that you have to follow. So you have to take that into account as well. So we said regrading or landscaping solutions, adding or expanding windows, opening up walls, replacing solid doors with ones that have glass, using trees and fencing for privacy. And then inside, final one here for this, if there are spaces that need more light and they are in different parts of the house, it could be worth swapping room purpose but leaving walls in place. Again, this is more affordable than taking down a wall, potentially replacing the flooring, moving the wall, that kind of thing. But if you, for example, have a bedroom that gets tons of natural light, but your dining room where you love to entertain is dark, then you could, in theory, switch those 2 rooms out for one another. Obviously, there'd be some adjustments, especially if your bedroom has a closet, or if it's on a different floor, that's not necessarily going to work. But you can shift room purpose from front to back or side to side to capitalize on what you already have outside of the home. You can't fake the sun, but you can harness it. Okay, so what if the issue with your crappy old house is that it is not suitable for modern convenience? There are many reasons for this, but I'll start here. Houses in the past were built and designed for lifestyles of the past. In the 1800s and the early 1900s, people quite literally had help. They had housekeepers and cooks who did the cooking, and the kitchen was designed to be out of sight and separate from entertaining and living areas. It was purely a functional space. Then you have kind of the 1950s and you have the 1960s, where the housewife becomes this elevated symbol of wealth and being successful, and she comes along with all of her appliances, and kitchens get smaller and food comes out of a can and requires one person versus a whole house full of staff. I know some people still did home cooking. I'm just speaking in generalities. So when you take all of that into consideration, it makes sense that places like kitchens, 1960s, 1950s, 1970s kitchens, often feel very dated and lack a lot of the modern conveniences that we are used to. The same thing goes for bathrooms that feature bathtubs that are lower, and garages that are narrower, and rooms that don't have huge closets. So if this is the solution, if this is the problem, the situation that you're facing, what is the solution? And I think really there are a few different steps. I love steps, and I love questions. The first one is to start with your budget. So stage one, start with your budget. We are all about affordability here, and you know that. So we have to work from our constraints, and budget is a very real constraint. So how much do you have to invest in changing this space? That's stage one. Stage two, recognize your practical constraints. So your budget is a financial constraint. You also have practical constraints. Can you extend the footprint with an extension or cut into another room? Are there things that can't be moved? Which, FYI, plumbing and electrical, if you move those, that automatically drives prices up. Sorry if you're a long-term listener, because I say that a lot, but it's true. Stage three is to be realistic and practical. So what can you, specifically you and the people that you live with, what can you live without? And I say that because just because everybody else is building a house with a mudroom doesn't mean that you have to have one. You might not need a mudroom. Just because your old house had a walk-in closet doesn't mean that your new house has to have a walk-in closet. And I'm saying all that because it leads me to stage 4, which is get creative. If you don't need a giant walk-in closet, instead of removing a whole bedroom to make space for one, go custom on cabinetry that lines an otherwise blank wall. If you have a large laundry room but no pantry storage in your small kitchen, combine the laundry and pantry into one space. And get smart with shelving and curtains to make it feel intentional and capitalize on space. The reality is that for something like this, where it's a modern convenience issue, the exact solution is really going to depend on the exact constraints and issues that you are facing. So I can give general advice here, but you also need pretty specific advice for what you're working on. If you can, work with a designer. This is why I try to be affordable in terms of pricing and accessible, because you're not going to know everything. You haven't been exposed to everything. It takes days, weeks, months, years to build up a knowledge of potential options and see something. And we're always encountering new things because we're looking for those things. So work with a designer, because there is always a solution for a problem. You just sometimes need to think outside the box a bit. Okay, so we've now covered site issues and modern convenience issues, and I realize I am racing through these. I was trying not to make this a 40-minute episode. Let's see how I do. The next one is if it just has crappy, not if it just has crappy architecture, if it hasn't been maintained. So if it hasn't been maintained, first of all, a word of caution. Huge, giant red flag word of caution. Like I said earlier, things can very easily become costly when it comes to an older home, and even more so when it hasn't been maintained. So you have to have the right strategy here, and the strategy here is all about prioritization. You really have to focus on that. And the priority for you, if you are in a crappy old house that hasn't been maintained, is to take care of all of the things that need to be maintained and protect the structural integrity of that house. And this can be really defeating because nobody walks into a house and says, well, the floors don't bounce, I'll pay $30,000. However, people do walk into the house and say, the floors are bouncing, I'm going to pay $30,000 less. And so this is really the rub here. And I understand that might make you think, is it worth it? But it is. It really is. Let me encourage you though. Even as you are prioritizing, that doesn't mean that there aren't other things that you can tackle. It just means that you're going to have to prioritize maintenance first before you get to aesthetics and practicality. There are still ways that you can do this simultaneously though. So, for example, if you need to replace the roof, but you were already planning on doing an extension in the attic and finishing it off, then you can do both at the same time. That just makes sense economically. Or, for example, if you were thinking down the line that you might want to replace all of the flooring and you have structural issues on the foundation, then it makes sense to tackle those structural issues and do the flooring at the same time. One more example. If you have to put insulation into the home because it was deteriorating or it doesn't have any, and you were already thinking about expanding some rooms or moving some of the walls around, then it makes sense to do both at the same time. So really what you're doing here is making economical choices that support both your practical long-term goals for the home and take care of the maintenance. You do have to be prepared to spend some money. It's just going to happen. And there's typically a snowball effect where you fix one thing and then you discover another thing as you fix it. But I think one of the keys here is just to make sure that you have a good contractor who can help you understand what makes the most sense to tackle together, and then a contractor who also really respects your budget and can help you maximize it. So that is for a house that has experienced deferred maintenance and hasn't been well taken care of. The final one. What if it has crappy architecture? Well, this I think is maybe one of the trickier ones. And I know that we just talked about maintenance, but I really think that this is tricky because it requires immense patience and immense attention to detail. The very first step here is research. You have to look into the history of the property. Was there an original architectural intention in the property? When it was built, what was happening in history? Are there old pictures of the property? What does it look like? What does it look like it was trying to resemble originally? These are the questions that you need to ask yourself when you are looking into giving it some architecture. And in some cases, houses just don't have an architecture. And in that instance, I would then say look to the site on which the house sits. So, for example, if houses around or in that area or your neighborhood's houses are typically in a distinct style, then I would lean into that. One of my favorite people to follow on social media right now is Brent Hull, and I'll include his Instagram handle in the show notes because I don't remember it exactly. I think it's Hull Millwork, but again, look in the show notes to confirm that. But Brent is incredibly knowledgeable when it comes to different architectural styles. And actually, at present, he is working on a home for his daughters that they purchased. And he is trying to bring architectural integrity to the building. And I think we can learn a lot from the way that he approaches this, because he looks not only at the house and notes the dates of certain things and can say, you know, that was arts and crafts, that was Greek revival, etc. But he can also say, well, when I look at all of the houses on this street, they are all built with red brick. That seems the more natural direction for this house versus grey painted brick, for example. And I do think that when we look around, we really ought to be somewhat influenced by what we see, not just driven by what we see. It shouldn't necessarily be the guiding force for the design choices that we make. But I do think we should be asking the question, what is the overwhelming architectural vernacular where I live? How can I design something that leads to continuity in the architectural vernacular versus being something that is quite jarring to the eye and to the landscape? If you think about it, this is why people don't like it when an older historic home is knocked down in a historic neighborhood. And when I say historic, I don't mean a landmark that's on the register. I just mean an older home. But this is why people get frustrated when a home is knocked down in a historic neighborhood and all of those homes have a certain type of style or come from a certain point in history and somebody just builds a modern box in their place. The reason this is frustrating is because it just does not fit with the overarching architectural vernacular that exists. It's interrupting the visual of the eye and the overall feel of the neighborhood. And so people, of course, have the freedom to make a space what they want it to be. If you buy a house and you knock it down and you want to build something more modern in its place, that's allowed. You can do it. It's your home. However, in many cases, people move into a neighborhood because they like the general feel of that neighborhood. And so having something that feels very different quite dramatically alters the feel of that neighborhood that they have chosen based on its feel, which can be quite jarring. So, okay, back to the main point here. Start with the history and do your research. Find out what makes the most sense for the house, for the area, and for you. That is where you start. And I will just say that I think architecturally, you should really be led by the history and the site. However, inside, when it comes to the interior design, I think you have a lot more freedom than you recognize. I think we all have a lot more freedom than we recognize. And so we don't need to be tied down to the, let's say, 1950s style of the home or the 1900s style of the home. And I think the people who are doing this the best are the Europeans, the Italians, the French, the Polish, and the Germans. They're all doing this really, really well. Sophie Davies Interiors, she does this really well. Fabrizio Casaraghi does this really well. Mistovia does this really well. And I'll make sure that I link all of them in the show notes. But there really is a beautiful thing that happens when you juxtapose ornate historic architecture with contemporary interior design. It can be done extremely well, and I think that those are some great examples, so make sure that you check them out in the show notes. Okay, that is it for this week's episode. We don't and we cannot all live in architectural gems. We can't control who lives in our house before us or who designed it unless we design it ourselves. So, if you are looking for advice as you begin the process of buying an old house, please fill out my buyer onboarding form. It's linked in the show notes, and that way we can work together. And if you have an old house and you need some support as you figure out what to focus on, please send us an email or reach out to me on Simply. I recently joined Simply, that's SMPLY, and it is a platform that allows you to set a budget and collect all your inspiration for your project in one place. It also allows you to chat and video call with designers about your projects for a really affordable flat fee so that you can get the direction that you need to make the best choices for your home. If you want to check out my profile on Simply, head over to www.madesmply.com. That's www.madesimply.com, or click the link in the show notes. That's it. Thank you for checking in with me this week on Lived In. We have one more episode left before we wrap up this season. So make sure to check back in 2 weeks to continue this conversation on how to make your ordinary home and ordinary life more beautiful. See you then.